Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at standardized testing in the U.S. education system. We'll be going deep with this one, using a summary of the 2013 documentary, Standardized: Lies, Money, and Civil Rights: How Testing is Ruining Public Education. I think everyone's heard all the arguments for and against standardized tests, but what if the whole system itself is actually flawed?
That's what this documentary really tries to get at. It digs into some really interesting stuff, like the business side of testing and how it affects students, teachers, even entire communities.
Yeah, and you might be surprised to learn that standardized testing is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Companies like Pearson and ETS.
The Educational Testing
Yeah,
Service.
exactly. They're making a ton of money from this. And this documentary raises the question of whether they're really invested in better education or just in making a profit. It's pretty thought-provoking.
It really is. It's a tough ethical question. When you have profit connected so closely to education, it makes you wonder where the priorities really lie.
For sure. And the documentary doesn't just stop at the money issue. It shows how much pressure these high-stakes tests create, especially for students, and especially for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. What stood out to you about that?
Well, one of the things the film argues is that this focus on standardized testing actually narrows the scope of what students learn. Instead of getting to explore all sorts of different subjects and ideas, they end up just memorizing facts so they can pass a test. It makes you wonder, are we really doing what's best for kids by making them memorize things instead of teaching them to think critically or solve problems?
Yeah, you're right. We might be teaching them to pass tests, but are we teaching them to think for themselves? And it sounds like the pressure isn't just on students. Teachers are feeling it too.
Oh, absolutely. When a teacher's evaluations are tied to their students' test scores, you can imagine the pressure they must feel. It leads to a lot of teachers just teaching to the test instead of focusing on what their students really need to learn.
Right. And the documentary has some really sad stories about really great teachers being penalized
Yeah.
or even losing their jobs just because their students didn't perform well on one test.
It's heartbreaking. And it makes you wonder, does one standardized test score really tell you how good a teacher is?
Right. Can you even measure something as complicated as teaching with just one test?
Exactly.
And while teachers are definitely feeling the heat from these tests, it's important to see how all of this ties into a much bigger issue: civil rights. This documentary connects standardized testing to how it affects marginalized communities.
Right, it's all connected. When you look at the bigger picture, you see how much damage overemphasizing these tests can do to these communities. Schools in low-income areas are often labeled as failing schools based on test scores, which leads to all sorts of negative consequences.
Right. And
It
so,
just creates this vicious cycle.
yeah, tell me more about that.
Well, imagine these schools facing budget cuts, fewer teachers, or even being shut down, all because their students didn't do well on standardized tests. It's like the system is designed to punish students who are already facing so many obstacles.
It's hard to hear that, to see how these tests can make inequality in the education system even worse.
Yeah.
But the documentary doesn't just focus on the problems, it looks at some potential solutions too, right?
It does. It shows how some really inspiring grassroots movements are fighting back against this over-reliance on standardized testing. You have parents, students, and teachers coming together to push for a better approach to education, one that's more meaningful and fair to everyone.
Yeah, it's like they're saying there's more to a kid's education than filling in bubbles on a test.
Exactly. They want to shift away from these high-stakes tests and move toward ways of assessing students that actually show what they can do, assessments that take into account all of their abilities and their potential as individuals.
So what would these alternative assessments look like? What kind of options are people talking about?
Well, one example the film gives is portfolio-based assessments. Instead of just looking at one test score, students put together a collection of their work over time. It's like a more complete way of looking at their progress. You can really see how they've grown and developed.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like showing the journey, not just the destination.
Exactly. And it lets students show what they know in ways that go beyond just filling in bubbles. They can be creative, show their critical thinking skills, and how they solve problems, all in a more real and authentic way.
I like that. I can see why people are interested in that. The documentary also talks about project-based learning, right? Where students get to work on real-world problems and actually use what they've learned.
Yeah, that's another great approach. It's a great way to get students excited about learning, and it helps them develop the skills they'll need in the 21st century.
Right, like collaboration and communication, and
Exactly.
it makes learning more relevant. Who wants to sit through boring lectures and worksheets when you could be working with your classmates to
Yeah.
solve a problem that actually matters?
Exactly. And it's important to remember that students need to be able to assess themselves too. to think about what they're good at and what they need to work on. That can be really powerful for them.
It's about becoming a lifelong learner,
Yes,
not just someone who takes tests.
exactly.
But I imagine that requires a big change in mindset, not just for teachers, but for everyone.
You're absolutely right. We need to stop obsessing over standardized test scores as the only way to measure success. We need to start recognizing that every student is different. They all have their own strengths and talents and ways of learning.
And we need an education system that values that diversity, not one that tries to make everyone fit into the same mold.
Exactly.
But if we were to move away from standardized testing, what would that actually look like?
Well, for one thing, we need to shift our focus from punishment to support. Instead of saying a school is failing because of test scores, we should be giving them the resources and support they need to address the real problems they're facing.
Right? It's like that saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime.
Exactly.
We need to give schools and teachers the tools they need to succeed,
Absolutely.
not punish them for things that are often outside of their control.
And we need to give teachers more freedom to be creative and innovative.
Yes.
Let them design their own lessons, create engaging experiences for their students, and help them develop a real love of learning.
Not just teach them how to memorize facts for a test.
Exactly.
And we can't forget about the students themselves. We need to listen to them, give them a voice in their own education.
Absolutely. After all, they're the ones who are most affected by all of this.
It's about working together, students, teachers, and parents, to create a learning environment that's supportive and challenging and inspiring.
I like that.
This documentary really makes you think about the purpose of education and how we define success.
It really does. It challenges us to think beyond just test scores and getting into college. Are those the only things that matter? Or is it more important to help students become well-rounded individuals who can contribute to society? That's a much bigger question.
And it makes you wonder who gets to decide what success even means in education.
Right.
Because the film shows how the current system often benefits those who are already privileged
Yeah.
and leaves others behind.
That's a really important point. We need an education system that's fair and just. One that gives every student a chance to reach their full potential, no matter who they are or where they come from.
That means addressing the systemic problems we talked about, like the huge differences in funding between schools in rich and poor neighborhoods.
Absolutely.
It's clear that just giving more standardized tests isn't the solution. We need to recognize that every student comes to school with different experiences, different needs, different ways of learning. A one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't work.
We need to move away from that old factory model of education, where everyone learns the same thing at the same pace. Imagine a system that's more personalized, where teachers can adjust their teaching to fit each student's individual needs.
That's a really powerful idea. This documentary has really made me think about how complicated standardized testing is and how much of an impact it has on education.
It's definitely a complex issue, and there's no easy fix. But the first step is to just start talking about it, to question what we believe and be open to new ideas.
So to wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question. If you could redesign the education system, what would you change? What would be your top priorities?
That's a great question. It's worth taking some time to really think about. What kind of learning environment would you create? How would you make sure that every student had the chance to succeed?
Because at the end of the day, isn't that what really matters? Helping every learner reach their full potential.
Absolutely. And while it might be a tough road ahead, it's a journey we need to take.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some new ideas to think about.
Yes, and we hope it sparked some important conversations. Until next time, keep those minds engaged. And it can become like this downward spiral,
Right.
These schools are already struggling, and then they get hit with budget cuts and staff reductions. Sometimes they even get shut down completely, all because of low test scores. It just doesn't seem fair. It's like the system is rigged against the students who need the most help.
It's really discouraging to see how these tests can make the inequality in our schools even worse.
Yeah.
But the documentary doesn't just point out the problems. It also explores some possible solutions, right?
Right.
Like, what are some of the things people are doing to try and fix this?
Well, the film highlights some really inspiring grassroots movements. These are groups of parents and students and educators who are fighting back against this over-reliance on standardized tests.
That's great.
They're advocating for a more well-rounded approach to education.
One that's actually fair and meaningful for all students. It's like they're saying, hey, there's more to a child's education than just bubbling in answers on a multiple choice test, right?
Exactly. They want to see a shift away from these high-stakes tests. and a move towards assessments that actually reflect a student's true abilities and their potential.
Okay, so what would these alternative assessments look like? What are some of the options that are being explored?
Well, one example the film talks about is portfolio-based assessments. So instead of relying on just one test score, students would create a portfolio of their work over time.
Oh, interesting.
It's like a more personalized and comprehensive way to evaluate their progress. You get to see the growth and development over time, not just a snapshot of their performance on one particular day.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like you said earlier, it's about showing the journey,
Exactly.
not just the destination.
And it gives students a chance to show what they know and what they can do. In ways that go beyond just filling in bubbles on a test sheet, they can express their creativity, their critical thinking skills, their problem-solving abilities in a much more authentic and meaningful way.
Yeah, I really like that. It seems like a much more holistic way to assess a student's learning. The
Yeah.
documentary also mentions project-based learning, right? Where students get to work on real-world problems and apply their knowledge in practical settings.
Yes, that's another really promising approach. It's a fantastic way to engage students,
Yeah.
to foster deeper learning, and to help them develop those essential 21st century skills that we keep talking about.
Right, because in the real world, it's not just about knowing the facts. It's about being able to use that knowledge to solve problems
Exactly.
and to work collaboratively with others.
Exactly.
And project-based learning gives students the opportunity to do all of that.
It does.
It makes learning more relevant and exciting. Who wants to sit through endless lectures and worksheets when you could be out there collaborating with your classmates to make a real difference in the world?
Right. It's so much more engaging and motivating for students.
Absolutely. And speaking of engagement, the documentary also emphasizes the importance of student self-assessment and reflection,
Yes, that's crucial.
encouraging students to take ownership of their learning, to identify their own strengths and areas for growth. That can be incredibly empowering.
It can. It helps them develop a sense of agency
Yeah.
and a lifelong love of learning.
It's about moving away from that passive role of just being a test taker and becoming an active participant in their own education.
Right.
But I imagine this kind of shift,
Mhm.
it requires a pretty significant change in mindset, not just for educators, but for society as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. We need to let go of this obsession with standardized test scores as the only measure of success. We need to start recognizing and valuing the unique talents and abilities of every student.
We need an education system that celebrates diversity, not one that tries to force everyone into the same mold.
Exactly.
So if we were to move away from standardized testing, what would that look like in practice? How would we support schools and teachers in making this transition?
Well, one important step would be to shift our focus from punishment to support. Instead of labeling schools as failing based on test scores, we need to invest in resources and support systems that address the root causes of educational inequities.
It's like that old saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day.
Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime.
Exactly. We need to empower schools and teachers to succeed,
Absolutely.
not punish them for things that are often beyond their control.
We need to give teachers the freedom to be more creative and innovative in their teaching, not force them to adhere to rigid, test-driven curriculums.
Right. It's about trusting teachers
Yes.
to do what they do best, which is to inspire and educate their students.
And it's about recognizing that every student is different and that they all learn in different ways.
So we need to create a system that's flexible enough to meet those individual needs.
Exactly.
A system that allows teachers to tailor their instruction, to create engaging and interactive learning experiences, and to foster a love of learning that goes beyond just memorizing facts for a test.
Absolutely. And we need to remember that students are not just passive recipients of information.
Right.
They need to be actively involved in their own education.
We need to give them a voice
Yes.
and listen to what they have to say. After all, they're the ones who are most affected by these decisions.
Exactly.
So it's really about creating a partnership
Mhm.
between students and teachers and parents,
Yes.
where everyone is working together.
To create a learning environment that is supportive and challenging and inspiring.
I love that.
That's a beautiful vision.
It is.
And it's one that I think we should all be striving for. This documentary has really opened my eyes to the complexities of standardized testing and the profound impact it has on our education system.
It's a really important conversation to be having, and I'm so glad that we're having it here today.
Yeah, it really gets you thinking and makes you question everything we think we know about education. Like, what does success even mean?
Exactly.
Is it just about getting good grades and getting into a good college? Or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, are we focusing on the wrong things?
Maybe. Maybe success is really about helping students develop into well-rounded individuals, people who can think for themselves, solve problems, and make a positive contribution to the world.
Right. It's about more than just memorizing facts and passing tests. And
Exactly.
a film also raises the question of who gets to decide what success even means. Because it seems like the current system is set up to benefit certain students.
The ones who are already privileged,
Yeah.
while other students are left behind.
It's like the system is perpetuating inequality.
It is, and that's something we need to change. We need an education system that's truly equitable, one that gives every student the opportunity to reach their full potential, regardless of their background or their zip code.
So how do we get there? If standardized testing isn't the answer,
It's not.
then what is?
Well, for starters, we need to stop focusing on punishment
Right.
and start focusing on support. Instead of labeling schools as failing, we need to invest in those schools, provide them with the resources they need to succeed.
We need to give teachers the support they need too.
Absolutely.
Give them the freedom to be creative,
To innovate.
to tailor their instruction to meet the needs of their students.
And we need to listen to students,
Yeah.
give them a voice in their own education.
Because at the end of the day, it's their education.
It is.
They should have a say in how it's run.
Absolutely.
This documentary has really given me a lot to think about.
Me too.
It's clear that standardized testing is a complex issue with no easy solutions.
But I think the most important thing is that we're having this conversation,
Yeah.
that we're starting to question the status quo.
And looking for better ways to educate our children.
Exactly.
But thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
And we hope it inspires you to continue this conversation in your own communities.
Because the future of education depends on it.
It does.
Thanks for listening, everyone.